Hello and welcome to Evangelical 360. I'm your host, Brian Stiller. Who would have guessed that an English professor in the 1940s in Oxford and Cambridge would become not only widely read, but widely trusted in the pursuit of faith in a secular age? C.S. Lewis was one of a kind. Today, in this age of spiritual quest and denial, his name comes up again and again. My friend, historian Mark Noll, has written about this very matter, also asking why an American audience would gravitate to his decades-old literature. Just for your information, Mark Noll, a preeminent historian of the church in North America, is an historian who has been so helpful to me over the years to understand the world of faith I occupy, where it came from, and how I can see it better today. And in this book, C.S. Lewis in America, he not only opens us to who in America took him in, but why. C.S. Lewis has been critical to many of us in our literary and faith journeys. His writings of logic and mystery bridge those two worlds like no one I've read. That's why Mark today will help us think about his value to our lives, and it may stir up your mind to read him again or for the very first time. And thanks to you for being a part of this podcast. As you listen, would you consider sharing this episode with a friend? And if you haven't, please hit the subscribe button by joining the conversation on YouTube in the comments below. Now to my guest, historian Mark Noll. Mark Noll, thanks for joining us again on Evangelical 360.
It's my privilege, Brian. I've enjoyed listening to some of the podcasts, and even I don't do podcasts, but some of yours have been grabbers.
Well, I'm a kind of a novice historian. I did my undergraduate in history, and I've read, I think, most of your books, but I was fascinated by this book, C.S. Lewis in America, which came out not long ago. And I'm both fascinated in C.S. Lewis as a writer, but I'm also interested in how those people, their lives, their writings, their ideas roll down from generation to generation. And so when I read this book, I thought, Mark, here's my way of bringing together one of my favorite writers and one of my favorite historians so we can have a chat about what's going on in the world today and how the past is impacting today, and asking you to kind of put your prophet's hat on, which is the antithesis to being a historian, and we think about the future. So, Mark, thanks for joining us. And C.S. Lewis in America today, maybe for some who aren't that familiar with C.S. Lewis, maybe you could give us a thumbnail sketch on who he is and what he wrote and his impact.
The book actually covers America and attention to C.S. Lewis in his early days, so up until 1947 when he appeared on the cover of Time magazine. But what people were discovering then is the same thing that people are continuing to discover today about C.S. Lewis. So he's born in Northern Ireland in Belfast, 1898. He is a precocious young man in his learning and in his sensitivity to the world. So his mother dies when he's young, maybe 9 or 10 years old. He's shipped off to boarding schools by his father. It's clear that he's very, very bright. He's clear that he's sensitive to morality. He loses his faith in boarding school, partly because he had prayed that his mother, who was suffering from cancer, would be healed, and she wasn't. His father sends him to study privately with a schoolmaster in England, whom the father had as a regular schoolmaster. Kirkpatrick was his name, and Lewis did study privately 1914 to 1917 in order to be prepared to go to the University of Oxford or Cambridge. He's admitted to Oxford after World War I has begun, in part because admission standards are lower. And that's actually a curiosity when we think about the brilliance of C.S. Lewis, that he was admitted to Oxford only because They needed students. His math was terrible. Everything else was wonderful. He volunteers for the British military. He serves on the Western Front in the front in France. He's wounded. He comes back to Britain. He's in convalescence for a while. Then after the war, he returns to his studies, and he has a brilliant career as an undergraduate at Oxford. He does what we would say in the U.S. is a triple major, the Greek and Roman classics, philosophy, and English. He then obtains a teaching position at Oxford, and he's there for the next 30 years until he, as a mature scholar in the mid-50s, he secures a position at Cambridge University. The really interesting thing about C.S. Lewis is his sensitivity to morality, his sensitivity to the life of the mind, and the way those develop. He wrote an autobiography published in the 1950s, mid-1950s, called Surprised by Joy, in which he traces the course of his early life as one who, as a very, very bright person, turns away from the Christianity of his inheritance and then gradually is brought back. Philosophical reasoning, moral reasoning pushes him toward accepting God, theism, and then by the early 1930s, he actually calls himself the most reluctant convert in Christendom when he acknowledges Christ and returns to the Christian faith. What sets Lewis apart, and this is very obvious in the early period that I was looking at, but it continues to be obvious today, is his desire to communicate broadly on Christian topics, but also his desire to be a first-order, reputable scholar of English literature. So in the 1930s, he publishes a very, actually it's difficult to read now, but a very complicated counterpart to the Pilgrim's Progress called the Pilgrim's Regress. It's an allegory about how his intellectual journey led him through all sorts of contemporary modern ways of thinking until he returned to Christian faith. The Pilgrim's Regress is published in 1935 or so. It's read in America with some appreciation, but there's no particular population or no particular audience for this. Then for the next 5 or 6 years, he mostly publishes works of literary criticism. There is eventually a very important book on Milton's Paradise Lost. He publishes a series of essays on medieval literature, the allegory of love, in which he says the high Renaissance in Britain is really important for bringing together courtly love and married love, which is actually an interesting development early on. But still, he's not much known in America. There is a number of professional journals that review these books, and then Lewis has something of a name. The really important development for Lewis's later career place outside of the classroom and outside of his life as an author when he's asked at the start of World War II to bring lectures to servicemen, usually the RAF, on Christian topics. What that urged him to do is to think about how to communicate important Christian truths in a way that would be presentable to a broader public. And as he went on, he got much better at being concise, which of course is not an academic specialty, much better at being concise, much better at bringing together clear conceptual presentation with forceful, imaginative writing. He's asked in these early days if he would bring radio broadcasts on the BBC introducing Christian faith, and he did so in the manner that he had learned how to talk to the troops. And so we have a series of radio broadcasts that are done in the roughly 1940, 1941, and then those broadcasts have begun to be published in booklets, but there's no real resonance in America yet. And there's no great popularity of C.S. Lewis even in Britain, although people know who he is, until in 1942, Lewis has published in Britain the Screwtape Letters, an imaginary dialogue between a senior devil and a junior devil who has the responsibility for one individual in wartime London. These Screwtape Letters are published serially in Britain and then brought out in a book in February of 1942. It's republished in America in 1943 in February, and there's an immediate enthusiasm for this writer. Most of the enthusiasm is just the wonderful device of presenting the Christian faith always backwards. The senior devil is always counseling the junior devil about how to work against the Christian influences that's coming to the subject. It's really just staggeringly innovative, funny, clear, but also poignant and helpful. What was intriguing to me in looking at the American responses to the C.S. Lewis is main American publications, the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, that were enthusiastic about the Screwtape Letters. Mainline Protestants in the U.S. were pretty enthusiastic. Evangelical Protestants were not. And maybe, Brian, we should find out later why it was that the tremendous enthusiasm for C.S. Lewis in evangelical circles comes later rather than earlier. The people who fastened on to Lewis first happened to be learned academic Roman Catholics who had known something about his earlier literary work and could combine their analysis of that literary work with now the popularity of the Screwtape Letters. Macmillan was Lewis's publisher. They saw the enthusiasm for the Screwtape Letters, and they immediately rolled out several other works, including some of the broadcast dives. I'll look at my list just to be sure I can get the order right. But then they also brought out the first of Lewis's space novels, so science fiction. He had been a great enthusiast for science fiction, but realized that there wasn't really often a lot of moral content. So he had published earlier a book called Out of the Silent Planet, which is a fictional journey of someone from Earth to Mars, where he finds out that the problems of Earth, warfare, strife, contention, are not present. Why? Because the Earth has become a silent planet in the control of an evil spirit, whereas Mars was a planet that was still dominated by the one true God. Of course, they don't use the word one true God. Macmillan rushes that book into print. Macmillan rushes the first of the radio broadcasts into print, and C.S. Lewis's popularity goes on from there. I end in 1947 when Lewis is a really popular person, but the great worldwide popularity comes just a little bit later. The first of Lewis's stories for children, the Narnia Tales, is published in 1950. The book Mere Christianity, that pulls together the booklets that had come from the radio broadcast, appeared only in 1952. So you have a period that I was looking at in particular where there's a kind of scattered appreciation for C.S. Lewis, academic, Christian apologist, fiction writer. But by the time we get to the 1950s and 1960s, including now, a lot of enthusiasm by evangelical Protestants as well as other Christians, C.S. Lewis becomes the figure that he is. And Brian, just before speaking to you today, I checked Amazon for best-selling books. Mere Christianity is the number one book today in Christian apologetics. It's number 38 in all of books. So you look at Amazon, what are the most purchased books right now? And right there is Mere Christianity. It's number one in books of essays. And books of essays, of the top 10 of Amazon, 3 of them are C.S. Lewis. So in an age where there's just tremendous concentration and focus on what's done now, with immediate desire to have an instant analysis of things that are happening in the present, you have the appearance of these books now. They're not ancient, but from the 40s and the 50s, that are still selling, still attracting readers, and still making a difference. That's a very abbreviated history of a very influential writing career, but it points to the fact that this person who was rooted in his own times, before World War I, during World War I, before World War II, during World War II, with literature not exactly addressing the times specifically, but coming out of those contexts, is literature that continues to have an appeal to this day.
Mark, you're without doubt the foremost historian of Christianity in North America. So why would C.S. Lewis attract your attention to spend your time in research and writing? What was there as an historian looking at the significance of various movements and ideas on our North American world? Why would C.S. Lewis be such an important person for you to take hold of?
Yes, that is an interesting question, and it brings into the picture how Lewis, writing primarily for his British context, was a person who doesn't really fit any of the main religious and even intellectual categories in the United States. So in the book, I point out how Lewis is celebrated first by Roman Catholics. Well, Lewis is not a Roman Catholic. He's an Anglican. I point out how Lewis is by and large, given very positive press by academics. And it's known that he's a Christian believer. And although the literary study in the US 30s, 40s, and 50s was not as secular it has become, still a literary scholar with Christian foundations was a little bit odd. And then amongst Protestants, C.S. Lewis is looked upon with some suspicion by evangelicals. He doesn't have the evangelical sense and emphasis upon an inerrant Bible. He clearly knows and honors and uses the scriptures, but he's not worried about biblical inerrancy. His lifestyle is British, ordinary Christian. There's a story about the famous American fundamentalist leader Bob Jones visiting C.S. Lewis in the 1950s, and he comes back to America. And of course, he's speaking to an audience of fundamentalists who are concerned about Christian faith, but also about a particular way of living. And apparently, Bob Jones said something like, well, that man smokes and that man drinks, but I do believe he is a Christian. There was this sense that Lewis has no natural constituency in America, but he writes so clearly and he writes so well. And here is a very important point. His apologetics for Christianity is what the famous book from 1952 called Mere Christianity. He's not presenting something that's only evangelical Protestant. He's not presenting something that's only Church of England, only Roman Catholic, but he's trying to present a vision of the Christian faith that takes in all branches of Christianity that have a particular traditional grasp of what we'd call the creedal, the Nicene, the Apostles' Creed foundation. Interestingly, when he was preparing the radio broadcast that eventually led to Mere Christianity, he sent out his broadcast to, I believe, 4 or 5 clerics, the Catholic priest, an Anglican, I think a Methodist, maybe one other person. And then they commented, and Lewis would adjust a little bit, at least, what he was preparing for the radio by what he heard from these people. So it was Mere Christianity. And then you can't really ever predict a kind of literary and intellectual genius of his kind. He was creative. He was clear. He was a brilliant writer. And those qualities meant that he could be attractive in religious and non-religious groups, even where he didn't come in as one of them. There's just a wonderful quotation by James Packer, J.I. Packer, writing after Lewis's death some years, about why he found Lewis really important. And I'll read that now because it answers the question why somebody outside the United States, really not fitting into any of the parties in American religions, could be so effective. The secret of Lewis's great piercing power lay in his blend of logic and imagination. All of his arguments, including his literary criticism, are illustrations in the sense that they throw light directly on realities of life and action. So the imaginative work is talking about serious life things. Well, all of his illustrations, including the fiction and fantasies, are arguments in the sense that they throw light directly on realities of truth and fact. So blending of logic and imagination, maybe not unique, but pretty close to being unique in the modern world. So mere Christianity, logic and imagination.
That captures my understanding. His logic is absolutely, it traps you. There's nowhere to go. When he's finished with you on a subject, there's just no exit. And yet his imagination, for years, I have an annual ritual of reading The Great Divorce. I've always been interested in life after death. And I've always felt that the metaphors that we, in our own evangelical world, especially our music, it conjures up corny, homely pictures that just seem to be so pedestrian to what I think heaven might be. And then I came across The Great Divorce, and the way he sets it up by being in that dreary city at a bus stop, and he eventually goes to heaven, and the metaphors and the imagination that he plays with, I find on a regular read opens to me other ideas of the possibilities of the eternity of our lives in ways that no one else has ever stroked. So J.I. Packer, his definition is powerful. So taking that, part of my interest in this conversation with you today, Mark, is that I find that both C.S. Lewis as an actual writer and what he can sponsor in giving imagination and possibilities to younger writers today, I simply have a great interest in moving people to be more familiar and ingest more of his writings. So with that kind of as a subtitle to our conversation or subtext, what is there going on in our world today that would produce the kind of analysis you just made by going to Amazon and finding out he's a number one of apologists, he's a number 4 in whatever else that you've described? Why is that landing with such solidity? And where's and with continuity out of the past? Why is that going on? In your view?
That really is a strikingly important and interesting question, particularly when we think about most of what is published and read today is mostly about from the present, about the present, with present understanding. I do think one of the secrets in Lewis is continuing authority, power, is that in his own day, and we have to think about Lewis comes to maturity during World War I. He's wounded in the struggle. He's part of British society in a very tumultuous 1920s. He experiences the Depression with everyone else. He's very actively involved in these enterprises around World War II. He's a person right at the center of British intellectual life. And yet in his works, you don't get the sense that he's talking to current events. You get the sense that he's talking about realities for all people at all time. Partly in writing the book a couple of years ago and partly in getting prepared for this interview today, I read more of Lewis, went back to Mere Christianity, read some of his essays, and there's datable matters. Lewis very often refers to man when we would today talk about humankind, men and women. There are a few places where Um, he's obviously thinking about a world that's settled, a world in which expectations of the next generation have something to do with what the previous generation. But by and large, the fact that he is usually reasoning from human condition and human actions and ordinary human relationships means that people can pick it up and read. Mere Christianity is a really good example. How can you defend the reality of Christian faith? With the radio broadcast, 1940, with the pamphlet, 1942, with Mere Christianity is a book in 1952. He begins with saying, almost everybody has moral conclusions about things in life. Something happens to you and you say it's not fair. Something happens to someone else and you say they deserved it. And then he goes on. Where does that sense come from that there are standards that we can apply to the behavior of other people? And then, of course, it's not all that simple how we develop it, but as he carries readers along, he says, well, it comes from the fact that there must be objective morality in the universe. And he explains that, takes objections, that goes further, and then in the next steps, and he does this pretty quickly, but it's still pretty complicated. The Christian faith fits nicely upon a universe in which everyone thinks that some things are right and some things are wrong. And so by not writing to the present that he lived in, he is actually writing about realities that continue in all times and all places. And that is one of the things that I think makes his work relevant to the day, as does also the fact that he is writing about mere Christianity and not presenting himself as an apologist for any one of the many varieties of Christian faith. And I would, Brian, to turn the reflection back on you, ask, I'm sure you have found in your travels around the world that at least some of C.S. Lewis's works translate very well. Wheaton College has a center, the Wade Center, that focuses on Lewis and his friends, and they have shelves full of books translated, Lewis's books, translated into a plethora of world languages, and all with at least some resonance, some stickability in those other cultures and other languages.
Oh, Mark, I'm just in reflection on your comment. I'm thinking I have in my hand the Screwtape Letters. Well, that translates into every world, and it's hilarious. It's counterintuitive, and it lands kerplunk in everyone's lives with realism and it's like, I never thought of that. So wherever you go, his logic and with his enormous capacity to interplay with other literary writers and ideas and myths, for him to bring those into play, as he did with some of his more mystical writings.
Brian, let me pause to emphasize that point. Lewis is an extremely learned person. I've read some of his literary criticism, and it holds up pretty well today. There's very little self-referential writing of C.S. Lewis about his own learning. You can glimpse it sometimes, but there'll be page after page after page that's direct, straightforward prose, not name dropping, but moving his argument, moving his presentation along. So the great learning, it was, I think, absolutely essential for his effectiveness, but it's learning worn very, very lightly.
And isn't that instructive to writers? You don't have to tell people on every page all that you know.
That's right. I mean, my instinct as a historian is always want to footnote everything. You want to footnote everything. Well, Lewis could have footnoted everything, but he realized that for most people, most of the time, What you want to hear is the presentation of a good story or a presentation of a solid argument. You're not so much concerned where it comes from unless you go deeper. And then if you do go deeper, you'll be able to find with a C.S. Lewis that there really is a full superstructure underneath what is so clear and transparent and moving on the surface.
Mark, I don't want to get ahead of history, but today, as we reflect on C.S. Lewis, the tragedy that was recently in your country, the death of a young man. At the same time, we're seeing the emergence of, I would call them kind of revival or spiritual renewal moments. They talk in England about the quiet revival. You see it both among Catholic and Protestant spiritual events that speak of spiritual interest and renewal. Ryan Burge, in his study primarily of the U.S., is showing that faith as a component of human life, of civilian life, is holding its own. The diminishment by way of secularity doesn't seem to be as precipitous or as severe as we thought, or maybe as it has been. So I as a historian, you may want to comment on whether you are seeing any kind of evidence of that. But my question to you is, when you look at the history of this man and what he has written, how is that speaking into today's world, with secularity, with maybe occasion of spiritual renewal, of war and disaster? How is he relevant to today?
I do think the situation you described for the U.S. Is intriguing people. My own sense is that trust in traditional Christian institutions maybe does continue to decline, but that interest in Christian questions and then interest in the broader category of spirituality, where the Christian faith has something to say, are maybe as strong as ever and maybe even growing. In those circumstances, what C.S. Lewis offered was, again, not commentary on the present, but pointing people to what was secure and solid. And I think it's important to recognize that it's probably the Narnia tales that are given the widest reading. It's narrative that doesn't seem to have anything to do with political polarization in our day, doesn't have anything to do with commentary on China and U.S., Russia and the U.S., war in Ukraine, Israel. But the stories present in a very subtle way the importance of a Christian understanding of the world, and even more, an importance of an understanding of Christ and the figure of the lion. And these stories are a kind of end run around objections or complete focus on the present, and have a tremendous resonance. So in the kind of situation you describe, when people are interested in helpful reading, they don't want to go to someone who's telling them how they should think about matters in the present. They want to go to someone who's trying to connect them to a deeper and more foundational and more stable understanding of the world. And Lewis, it's not the only one, but Lewis certainly falls into those categories. And again, just the clarity of thought and expression are so unusual that they draw interest and often commitment from readers.
What's been your favorite?
My wife and I read the Narnia tales probably 5 or 6 times to our kids, so I probably have to say those. As a historian, I really like his long and detailed book called The Oxford History of English Literature of the 16th Century, excluding drama.
Oh.
It's not exciting in the way that like the Great Divorce or the Space Ransom trilogy is, But there's wonderful writing on figures like William Tyndale, Thomas More. There's terrific passages about how the language of the King James Version reflects, in some ways, Shakespearean language. I mean, it's a real treat for historians, but I think for reading to come back to. I'm actually going back to read the Narnia tales long after our children are out of the household, because you can tell they're written from the early 50s now, but there's just so much good sense and so much decision making by the characters that reflects an awareness of the morality of the universe, that they really become captivating.
But Mark, what does that do for you in your thinking and your own spiritual quest?
I do think that Lewis has a way, often, certainly not everything he wrote, but often to bring you back to first principles. I remember when we had a special chapel service at Wheaton College on the afternoon of 9/11/2001, and our provost, Stan Jones, read at length from Lewis's sermon, Learning in Wartime, in which Lewis tried to say, we have every reason in the world now, this was 1940, 1939, to be worried about how events are developing in Europe in the war, but there's also real good reasons for staying focused on what you're trying to do in an academic institution. It was his way, our provost and Lewis earlier, of saying, look, the events of the world are going to be disorienting. They're going to be disruptive, but we need to focus in, retain a grasp on what's most important. And I do think, in a singular way, Lewis's entire body of work tried to get people to remain focused on what was most important.
And if you were doing a podcast with C.S. Lewis today, what one question would you want to ask him?
I think maybe I'd ask him what he gains by his practice, and he's mentioned this several times in his life. What did he gain by his practice of not reading the daily newspaper? And that kind of, I think if we could talk to him today, the corresponding question would be, what is gained if you just don't look at your phone? And I think what Lewis would say is, I don't read the daily newspaper, not because things are unimportant that are going on day by day, but because the permanent truths, the permanent needs of human beings are always more important than the day-to-day diversions that call us away from these most important things. I think that's what I think that's what he would say, but I would like to ask him that question.
Okay, Mark, let's land on a conversation with where would a person who is not that familiar with Lewis, where do you think, what should be their first, second, and third books to read?
I do think if someone is interested in a logical presentation of basic Christianity, Mere Christianity is still a very important book to read. And over the time, there's been some really nice books. George Marsden wrote a very fine book on the biography of Mere Christianity. And he could point out how a number of influential people, Chuck Colson, Francis Collins, others have found this to be a brief but compelling understanding of the Christian faith. For the literary minded, I think that at least the first two, maybe all three of what are called the Space Trilogy or the Ransom Trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet. So the protagonist goes to Mars. Paralandra, the protagonist goes to Venus. And the plot is, what would the world be like if Eve had resisted the devil, Satan, in the Garden of Eden? So that's an event. And then the third one, That Hideous Strength, is set on Earth. They're more complicated, but these are really intriguing ways of telling stories, not focused on Christian faith, but communicating not focus on the detail of the Christian faith, but focusing on the kind of universe of the Christian faith. And then for anyone who would like to see how imagination can draw people without even seeming to try toward an understanding of the Christian faith, then I think the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then the 6 books that followed, and the Narnia tales would be my recommendation.
And I'd like to add one, The Problem with Pain, for those who struggle with the existential issues of personal living.
Brian, I think that I would agree with you that The Problem of Pain is a masterful response to the question, why does God allow suffering? People should, however, if they read that, also read in tandem with that a book that Lewis wrote later after his wife, Joy Davidman, died, called A Grief Observed, which is much less, I would say, rational, but much more emotionally powerful about someone who's experienced great loss. So the combination of those 2 books really make a strong intervention in what we all experience in one way or sometimes in our lives about our asking, oh God, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to so-and-so? And those are passionate and powerful works.
And Mark, on that, we end a very rich conversation on C.S. Lewis and his enduring legacy and the value that he brings as a Christian witness to us in any aspect of life. So thank you. Thank you for joining me on Evangelical 360 today, Mark.
Brian, it's been my privilege, and thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for joining me today. Your mind in canvassing our past helps us see today with greater clarity. And on the matter of this extraordinary writer, C.S. Lewis, our understanding of him and his value to us has been broadened. And to you, friend, thanks for being a part of the podcast. Be sure to share this episode and join the conversation on YouTube. If you'd like to learn more about today's guest, be sure to check the show notes for links and info. And if you haven't already received my free ebook and newsletter, just go to brianstiller.com. Thanks again. Until next time.
Don't miss the next interview. Be sure to subscribe to Evangelical 360 on YouTube.